Picture a freezing, pitch-black night in the dead of winter, 1957. Across the United States, the glowing amber dials of millions of heavy bakelite radios illuminate the darkened living rooms of the American public. In this era, before television fully dominated the media landscape, the midnight AM radio broadcast was the absolute heartbeat of the nation. Shift workers, long-haul truck drivers, and insomniacs were all tuned in to the massive 50,000-watt clear-channel stations that bounced their signals off the ionosphere, covering thousands of miles. The airwaves were filled with the smooth, comforting sounds of late-night jazz and the deep, resonant voices of national newscasters. And then, at exactly midnight, the heartbeat stopped. Coast to coast, simultaneously, the broadcasting signal did not fade into static. It was violently, mechanically severed. The smooth jazz was replaced by a heavy, suffocating dead air. Millions of listeners leaned in, tapping the glass dials of their radios, assuming a blown vacuum tube. But the radios weren't broken. A few seconds later, the speakers began to emit a sound that was not supposed to exist in the 1950s. It was a heavy, rhythmic, industrial oscillation, a mechanical pulse, followed by a chilling, synthetic-sounding voice that belonged to no known broadcaster. No government agency issued a warning. No hacker was ever caught. The FBI was confronted with an act of mass electronic infiltration decades before the concept of cyber warfare was even invented. This is the heavily classified, officially unsolved story of the greatest broadcast hijacking in American history. Welcome to the Wayne Archive, the digital vault, where we intercept the suppressed signals and classified frequencies of America's darkest history. In the high-stakes, paranoid era of the 1950s Cold War, the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and the FBI maintained an iron grip over the nation's airwaves. The physical infrastructure of radio was massive and heavily guarded. Broadcasting required towering steel antennas, massive liquid-cooled transmitters, and highly regulated federal licenses. The idea that a rogue entity could simply step into the frequency of a major network and overwrite their signal was not just illegal. It was considered mathematically and physically impossible without military-grade equipment. Yet for 6 agonizing minutes, an unknown subject seized control of the American consciousness, bypassing the most heavily defended communications grid on the planet. The federal government desperately tried to label it a localized technical glitch, burying the FBI field reports and silencing the audio engineers who were in the control rooms that night. Today, we are tearing the redaction tape off the Federal Communications Commission archives. We will step inside the panic-stricken broadcast booths, analyze the terrifying audio that came through the speakers, and expose the absolute technological impossibility of the phantom transmission. Lock your doors, dial in the frequency, and let's enter the dead air. To fully comprehend the sheer, paralyzing terror that gripped the federal government, you must understand the sheer physical magnitude of what was hijacked. We are not talking about a low-frequency, amateur ham radio station operating out of a suburban garage. The targets were the undisputed titans of mid-century American media, the 50,000-watt Class A clear-channel stations. Networks like WGN in Chicago, WSM in Nashville, and WCBS in New York. These stations possessed exclusive rights to their specific frequencies. Their massive, heavily fortified transmitter towers pumped out a ground wave signal so intensely powerful that a single station could blanket half of the North American continent after sunset. Overriding a signal of that immense magnitude required a staggering, almost incomprehensible output of electrical wattage. The timeline of the anomaly began on a Tuesday night at exactly 11:59 p.m. Inside the heavily soundproofed, smoke-filled control rooms of these flagship stations, the atmosphere was entirely routine. Audio engineers wearing thick bakelite headphones sat behind massive steel-cased RCA mixing consoles, monitoring the heavy oscillating needles of the VU meters. The disc jockeys were speaking into heavy chrome ribbon microphones, preparing to read the top-of-the-hour news bulletin. As the studio clocks clicked to exactly 12 o'clock a.m., the primary carrier waves across the entire eastern seaboard were instantly, simultaneously crushed. Inside the broadcast booths, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. The heavy analog needles on the mixing consoles violently pinned all the way into the red, indicating a massive, unauthorized spike in audio levels before instantly dropping to zero. The audio engineers instinctively slammed their hands onto the main faders, trying to boost their own studio microphones, but the heavy mechanical switches were completely unresponsive. The studio monitors, which normally fed the live broadcast back into the booth, went entirely dead. The engineers assumed a catastrophic failure at the transmitter site, a blown master vacuum tube or a severed coaxial cable. In a state of sheer panic, the lead technician at the CBS affiliate in New York grabbed the red emergency telephone connecting the studio directly to the transmitter tower, located miles away in the marshlands. When the transmitter engineer answered, he was shouting over the deafening roar of the liquid cooling pumps. He reported that the massive 2-story tall transmitter was operating flawlessly. It was pushing 50,000 watts of power directly into the antenna, but the signal radiating from the tower was no longer their own. Someone, or something, had engaged a technique known as broadcast overpowering. To execute this in the 1950s, the unknown subject would need to transmit a rogue signal on the exact same frequency, but at a significantly higher wattage, essentially drowning out the legitimate broadcast through sheer, brute force electrical trauma. To overpower a 50,000-watt clear channel station, the hijacker would theoretically need a transmitter capable of outputting 100,000 watts or more, equipment that only the United States military or heavily funded foreign intelligence agencies possessed. Furthermore, this was not an isolated, localized attack. It was happening simultaneously across multiple frequencies in multiple states. Then, the dead air broke. Through the millions of radios in homes, diners, and patrol cars across the country, a sound emerged that sent a visceral, collective chill down the spine of the American public. It began as a low, mechanical drone, similar to the heavy, oscillating hum of a massive electrical turbine. It was deeply resonant, vibrating the heavy wooden cabinets of the floor-standing radios. After 15 seconds of this hypnotic, industrial pulsing, the drone faded into the background, and a voice broke through the static. It did not sound like a human being speaking into a standard microphone. It possessed a harsh, metallic, heavily distorted cadence, devoid of any emotional inflection or breath pauses. The voice did not deliver a political manifesto. It did not declare war. It simply began reading a highly complex, sequential string of alphanumeric codes and raw, unencrypted geographical coordinates. Bravo, 7, Niner, Echo, incline, 40 degrees, 42 minutes, 46 seconds north. The delivery was cold, mathematical, and terrifyingly precise. In the immediate aftermath, thousands of terrified citizens flooded the switchboards of local police precincts, convinced that a Soviet invasion had just been initiated, or that they were listening to the activation codes for an atomic strike. The FBI and the FCC were instantly mobilized, fully expecting to intercept a foreign espionage operation. But when the federal monitoring stations attempted to triangulate the origin of the massive rogue signal, the mathematical data they received from their radar arrays was so physically impossible that the director of the FCC classified the telemetry reports on the spot. As the cold, synthetic voice continued to read the unencrypted coordinates across the hijacked frequencies, the Federal Communications Commission initiated a massive emergency response protocol from their primary monitoring station in Grand Island, Nebraska. In the 1950s, tracking an unauthorized radio transmission was a highly physical mathematical process known as radio direction finding, or RDF. The FCC maintained a heavily classified network of listening posts scattered across the continent, equipped with massive, rotating adcock antenna arrays. These arrays were designed to hunt down rogue transmitters by rotating the antennas until the incoming signal dropped to its absolute weakest point, a mathematical acoustic void known as the null. By drawing a straight line from the monitoring station toward the null on a massive topographical map and intersecting it with lines drawn from other listening posts, the technicians could pinpoint the exact geographic location of the pirate transmitter. Inside the Grand Island facility, the atmosphere was absolute chaos. Technicians in short-sleeved white button-downs and thin black ties frantically dialed the heavy brass-geared tuning knobs on their massive Collins radio receivers. The mechanical pulse of the hijacked signal was so violently powerful that it was physically shaking the heavy glass vacuum tubes inside the chassis. The lead engineer grabbed a red grease pencil and stood before a massive wall-mounted map of the United States. He waited for the incoming coordinates from the listening posts in Maryland, Texas, and California. The government operated under the strict, terrifying assumption that they were about to triangulate a massive, covert Soviet communications array hidden deep within the American wilderness, or a heavily armored submarine surfacing off the Atlantic coast. But when the telemetry data finally began clattering across the encrypted teletype machines, the geometry of the triangulation lines was completely, fundamentally impossible. The technician from the Maryland listening post reported a massive directional bearing, but the signal wasn't originating from a fixed terrestrial point. The null was shifting. The Texas station confirmed the anomaly. The technician at the map dragged his red grease pencil across the plexiglass, tracking the intersection of the bearings. The source of the transmission was moving, but it was not moving at the speed of a disguised cargo truck or standard military aircraft. According to the raw, unassailable mathematics of the RDF arrays, the 100,000-watt transmitter was traveling across the continental United States at a velocity exceeding 4,000 miles per hour, more than 5 times the speed of sound. In 1957, the absolute bleeding edge of aviation technology, the experimental Bell X-2 rocket plane, had barely touched Mach 3 before catastrophically breaking apart. There was absolutely nothing in the known human arsenal capable of flying at Mach 5, let alone a vehicle massive enough to carry the heavy electrical generators, liquid cooling pumps, and towering antennas required to overpower every clear-channel radio station in America simultaneously. The panic inside the FCC monitoring station deepened into a cold, suffocating dread. The lead engineer ordered the tracking stations to recalibrate their arrays, assuming a massive mechanical failure in the equipment. They switched to a secondary, highly classified vertical triangulation method designed to measure the angle of the radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere. The teletype machines printed the secondary data. The engineer stared at the numbers, the red grease pencil snapping in his trembling hand. The signal wasn't just moving at an impossible hypersonic velocity. The vertical telemetry indicated that the transmission was not originating from within the Earth's atmosphere. The massive, overpowering radio wave was blanketing the United States from an altitude of over 200 miles in the exosphere. It was broadcasting from deep space. This realization completely paralyzed the federal government. This was months before the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The official historical record dictates that there were absolutely no artificial satellites in orbit in the winter of 1957. Humanity had not yet breached the atmosphere, yet the unyielding mathematical reality of the triangulation data proved that a massive, highly sophisticated, hypersonic transmitter was currently orbiting the planet, explicitly targeting the American radio grid and broadcasting a synthetic voice that no human being could identify. The military immediately scrambled heavily armed, radar-equipped interceptor jets, but they were flying blind into the dark night sky, hunting an invisible ghost that was broadcasting from the untouchable void of space. At exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds past midnight, the broadcast violently terminated. There was no fade-out, no concluding statement, and no mechanical click of a microphone being switched off. The heavy, industrial oscillation and the cold, synthetic voice were instantly severed, creating a vacuum of dead air that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then, the heavy analog relays in the terrestrial radio stations snapped back into alignment. The smooth jazz music and the startled voices of the national newscasters instantly flooded back into the millions of living rooms across America, picking up mid-note as if the last 6 minutes of existential terror had never occurred. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in aggressive, ruthless federal censorship. The Department of Defense and the FBI initiated an unprecedented, unified lockdown of the American media apparatus. By 1 a.m., fleets of unmarked black sedans arrived at the transmitter sites and broadcast studios of every major radio network. Federal agents physically removed the audio engineers from their heavy mixing consoles. They seized the massive reel-to-reel magnetic tapes that had recorded the broadcast logs. They threatened the station managers with immediate federal treason charges and the permanent revocation of their FCC broadcasting licenses if they ever acknowledged that the hijacking had occurred. The public narrative was brutally suppressed. When thousands of terrified citizens called the local newspapers and police precincts demanding to know what they had heard, the government issued a blanket, highly coordinated statement. They blamed a rare atmospheric anomaly known as tropospheric ducting, claiming that a military weather balloon had accidentally reflected a highly distorted, localized military transmission back down to Earth. It was a laughable, mathematically absurd explanation that completely ignored the 100,000-watt power requirement, the simultaneous nationwide override, and the chilling synthetic voice. But in the 1950s, the word of the federal government was absolute. The newspapers printed the weather balloon story, the radio stations remained violently silent, and the American public was forced to swallow the lie. But the FBI could not erase the physical evidence hidden within their own classified vaults. The audio recordings seized from the radio stations were transported to a highly secure acoustic laboratory in Washington. When military cryptographers finally decoded the long string of alphanumeric coordinates broadcasted by the synthetic voice, the mystery deepened into a terrifying psychological abyss. The coordinates did not point to major American cities, military bases, or critical infrastructure. They pointed to incredibly remote, desolate, and entirely uninhabited locations. A frozen, barren glacier in the deep Antarctic, a specific, microscopic patch of the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean, a barren expanse of the Sahara Desert. There was no strategic value to these locations. There was no military objective. The highest-ranking behavioral analysts concluded that the broadcast was not an attack. It was a demonstration. The unknown entity, whether it was a highly advanced, deeply embedded rogue domestic black ops program utilizing technology decades ahead of the public sector, or something entirely outside the realm of human origin, was sending a message to the architects of the American security grid. The message was simple. Your infrastructure is fragile. Your skies are open. We possess the technological capacity to seize the absolute attention of your entire nation simultaneously, and you are physically, mathematically powerless to stop us. To this day, the complete telemetry reports from the Grand Island FCC monitoring station remain heavily redacted. The original, unedited master tapes of the broadcast are locked in a deep subterranean vault, classified under a sweeping national security embargo. The event was surgically excised from the history of American broadcasting, leaving nothing but a lingering, paranoid whisper among the audio engineers of the Kodachrome era. When we turn on a television, connect to a wireless network, or tune a radio dial, we operate under the comforting illusion that the invisible frequencies surrounding us are strictly controlled and safely regulated. We believe that the heavy steel towers and the massive government agencies stand as an impenetrable wall between our living rooms and the terrifying unknown. But the suppressed reality of the 1957 hijacking proves that the airwaves are not a sanctuary. They are a vulnerability. The federal government did not bury this file because they solved the mystery. They buried it because the absolute, terrifying truth was that they had no idea who seized the microphone, where they were broadcasting from, or when they might decide to speak again. If this deep dive into the classified, static-filled archives of American history made you question the safety of the signals bouncing through your own home, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Wayne Archive. We will continue to triangulate the suppressed data, decode the Black Ops telemetry, and expose the phantoms that bypassed the system. Review the coordinates, analyze the impossible physics of the RDF triangulation, and drop your ultimate theory on the true origin of the Midnight Hijacker down in the comments section below. Do you believe it was a rogue, highly classified military psychological operation, or was it something looking down at us from the cold void of the exosphere? Thank you for stepping into the archive with us today, and remember, just because you can't see the signal doesn't mean it isn't listening.